Okay, hello students. This is Mr. Schulke. I am going to show you how we're going to use the project rubric for your distance learning success strategies project to grade your rough draft. Now, whatever version your rough draft is, it needs to meet the same requirements. So whether you're doing a slideshow or a digital story or a poster or an infographic or an animation, no matter what it is, it has to meet the same requirements. Because remember, the objective is to teach other people about your topic, including ways to mitigate some of the effects of being in this different kind of distance learning environment. So, when you look at this rubric, it has multiple columns and multiple sections. So let's look at the columns. First across the top, all the way on the left, 15 points, excellent. That means that if for a certain category, all of the criteria for that category are met, they get 15 points, meaning they did excellent for that category or that section. Next, we have 10 points, meaning there's room for improvement. It means it's pretty good, but there are a couple things you need to change. And look what it says. One or two areas under excellent are missing or incomplete. That means if while you're grading it, for instance, if you're grading the introduction, one or two of these areas are missing, then you give them 10 points instead of 15. You give that section 10 points instead of 15. So, for instance, if you're grading the project, the rough draft, and it explains the epidemiology, but doesn't define what the problem is, doesn't actually say what they're trying to solve, then you would take off 5 points and only give 10 here instead of 15. Now, the category 5 points, meaning needs work, means these things. If the topic is too broad or vague, then we would bring that all the way down to 5 points. Hopefully no students have that because we've talked quite a bit about your topics. If there's no guiding problem or question, meaning they don't actually state that this is a problem that we're trying to help students with, or there's no question that they're trying to answer, meaning how do we help students with this, or how are students being affected in this way, then you would only give 5 points. And if more than two areas under excellent are missing or incomplete, meaning this section here, if more than two of these big bullet points are missing, then you would only give 5 points. And if there's really no effort, if that section doesn't even exist, then you would give 0. And the same applies to every section. So the criteria are spelled out here. The way you grade this is go through every section and look for everything in the bullet points. Let's show you how to do that with an example. This project was actually created by students, and this is their rough draft. So that means it's not finished, and they know it's not finished. They know it needs work. And the point of us grading it at this point is to notice everything that they still have an opportunity to work on. So let's look through it. Let's look at their introduction section. And they actually have it labeled as introduction. And I removed the students' names on purpose. So in their introduction, they do have it labeled. You don't need to label your sections. It's pretty easy to tell when you transition from the introduction to the background to the recommendations. But here we explicitly know. So the only way to grade it is to look through it and read every piece. Let's review the things we're looking for. Introduces a specific impact of distance learning as a phenomenon. That means demonstrates something, like explains that this is the problem we're trying to solve. Explains the epidemiology, meaning who is it affecting and how common is it. Defines the problem, meaning a guiding question, and cites some sources for their information. Okay. So they start out, is distance learning contributing to stress in junior high school students? So this is a really good guiding question. Very good. So already we know that this defines the problem. That's already covered. Answer, distance learning is contributing to stress in junior high school students. In a 2020 study, 160 junior high school students were asked, have you been feeling more stressed about assignments during distance learning than you have during traditional school? 123 of them said yes, and 37 of them said no. Well, that's the epidemiology. That's who is it affecting? Okay, So that covers this part of epidemiology. Who is it affecting? Very good. Also in the introduction, how common is it? Junior high school is full of new things. This can become overwhelming, can lead to stress, but how common is it? Sounds like they kind of wanted that to go before that first question. So clearly this is something they're still working on organizing. So what did we miss? Did we introduce a specific impact of distance learning as a phenomenon? Yes, they introduced the topic of stress. Did it explain the epidemiology? We're talking about who is it affecting and how common is it? I would give full points for this because they referred specifically to junior high school students because that's what we're studying. And they used some data to show how common it is. Did we define the problem with a guiding question? Well, we kind of did. We have the question, how common is stress among junior high school students? Um, is distance learning contributing to stress in junior high school students? Okay, we have some good guiding questions, but remember, one thing we're trying to accomplish with this is to make recommendations to help students with their stress. How can students cope with stress during distance learning? We would want to see that. So I might actually take off points here. And also, I don't see any sources cited. It doesn't really say where we got this information from. Now, I know that we actually made this survey, but there should be some more information in the introduction about distance learning that they got from a scientific source. So I would actually take off points for this. So I would actually give 10 out of 15 for this section. So I'm going to erase these lines and put 10. And I'm going to make that in red so that we can see the score, okay? Now the background, explain the underlying science. We're going to look for these things. It sufficiently explains the science underlying the problem. It includes visual aids. It includes text and or verbal explanation. And it cites at least 2 reliable academic sources. Oh, by the way, for this here, I'm going to, if I were grading my own, I would put these things in red so that I knew to go back and fix them later. That's pretty good. There we go. Okay, so let's go back to the background. Question, what effect does stress have on the human body? Very good question. So this is a quote here. All quotes need citations. So right away, I know that we are not citing all of our sources. So I'm going to say we're going to take points off for that, definitely. Does it have a text explanation of what stress is and how it's happening? Let's keep reading. How does your brain cope with stress? Well, it doesn't really explain what's happening in your body. I don't understand what stress in your body is. It says that we can have anxiety, depression, weight gain. Okay, but why is that happening? I'll bet it's because of that stress hormone we keep hearing about, but I don't see that explained here. Let's keep reading and see if it's in there. How does your brain cope with stress? When you're stressed, and this, by the way, should be your. Let's move this out of the way. Do you ever feel nervous and sweaty? Question mark. Maybe you can feel your heart pound a little harder than normal. Well, this is because when you are stressed, your body goes into fight or flight. What is fight or flight? Should we put that in quotes or italics since nobody really knows what that is yet? And we need a source for that information. No, they didn't make that up. I want to know where that information came from. So I'm going to take off points for that too. Okay. So we've got how does stress affect the human body? How does stress affect the human brain? How does this part of the human brain or body function under ideal conditions? Well, we're talking about the effects, but again, it doesn't explain why it's happening. That's really useful, but I still don't understand what stress is. What is stress doing to the body? So I think it's kind of an incomplete explanation. There's some good information there, but it's not a complete explanation. Um, there are different parts that perform different tasks. That doesn't tell me why it happens. So I still, after reading those slides, I'm really unclear about what stress in the body is and what is it actually doing. So I would take off some points for that. And do we have visual aids? We have this one visual aid. And can I tell what it is? Man, that doesn't really. I think this has something to do with cortisol and the kidneys and the brain, but I can't tell what's happening. And so this is a really good example of, if you don't know what that visual aid means, don't use it. It doesn't add anything to your presentation. So I'll bet they do understand this, just haven't taken the time to write out and explain it. So for this background section, we have one visual aid that doesn't really add anything. So I would take off points for visual aids, and I would take off points for sufficiently explains. So for the background, I would probably even give this a 5 out of 15 for the background. Okay. Still not quite all the way there with understanding it. Maybe there's a little more research to do. Okay, now the recommendations. Suggest strategies to mitigate the impacts or symptoms. All these bullet points need to be hit. So let's look at it. Recommendations. Some steps, this is a plural word, so you can take to avoid stress are, and grammar, are to do physical activities such as jogging or yoga, eat a healthy and diverse diet, avoid unhealthy habits like biting your nails or hitting yourself when this should be you're mad, meditate, doesn't need to be capitalized, laugh more, connect with others like fix your sleeping schedule, comma, and listen to or make music. This clearly came from a website somewhere, very obviously. So it needs a source. So right away, I'm going to take off points for the sources because that looks like it's plagiarized. All right. What else? It mentions a lot of things that you can do as recommendations, but doesn't explain why they work. Let's keep reading and see if it's there. Again, this you're. Remember, if you mean to say, if someone you are living with, that is the contraction of the words you and are, which means it has an apostrophe. What can you do if someone you're living with is causing that stress? If someone you are living with is causing you stress, you can be proactive. Think of what they're going to say beforehand and plan what you are going to say back. Control your reaction. Again, this clearly came from a website. I'll bet I could find this online. I'll bet if I just copy and paste that, I can find the article that this came from and prove that it's plagiarized. And if this is students making this stuff up, I mean, an 8th grader is not really qualified to give mental health advice, so I would be really skeptical of it, okay? So we have some recommendations, and they're very good recommendations. Um, However, it doesn't explain why they work. So let's look at this. There are some visual aids. I don't know what the U-Haul is. Does that mean you're going to move out of your parents' house? Not quite sure what that's supposed to mean. And driving? What does that help? And money? These pictures don't help explain what's right here. So if you have a picture on a page, it needs to have a purpose. It needs to help explain what you're saying here. So we have a lot of cool pictures, but I don't understand what they have to do with this paragraph. So I'm going to take off points for visual aids. Okay. Explains why these strategies are effective using scientific arguments. Now, if you explained in here that you read a study or an article and cited your source and said that that article explains how these things can lower cortisol levels or lower your heart rate or your blood pressure or lead you to feel less stressed, then that would be an explanation with some evidence. But I don't see that there. So I would take off points for that too. So it does suggest multiple strategies, but it doesn't explain why they work scientifically. The visual aids don't seem to apply to what's being explained, and there's no citations. So I would give this a 5 out of 15. Some effort there, but it's not quite meeting the requirements of the rubric. All right, let's look at now our visual aids. Visual aids are used in 3 sections. They need to use in our introduction or phenomenon, our background, and our recommendations. So let's look back through again. Okay, I see some pictures of meditating and sleeping in the recommendations. There's a visual aid, but it's not explained in the background, so I'm going to take points off for that. And then the introduction, there's a table. A data table's good. That's a visual aid. We could also use a pie chart or something else, but I'll bet that there's another visual aid we can come up with for that category. So visual aids are pertinent and help explain or clarify the information. In some of the areas they do, in some of the areas they don't. Like I don't understand what some of these visual aids are meant to do. Okay. Visual aids taken from other sources are properly sourced and cited. Oh, I can't tell where any of these pictures came from. And I'll bet some of them came from private websites. So they're probably copyrighted, and it's probably a violation of copyright law to have them on here. So I would take points off for that. Yeah, for sure. And then we're missing visual aids a little bit. I'm not going to count that one that's in the background because I don't understand what it means. It's not adding anything without it being explained. So I'm going to take points off for that too. So for this, again, I'm going to say 5 out of 15. Okay, 5. 5 out of 15. All right, one more section, sources. Sources are cited for introduction, phenomenon, background, recommendations. I actually didn't see any in-text citations in any part of the report, so I'm going to give this 0. 0 out of 15. Now let's add those up. 10 plus 5 is 15, plus another 5 is 20, plus another 5 is 25. So this project would get 25 out of 75. Okay, 25 out of 75 is a 33%. So we can see some of the areas for improvement. Now, you would go ahead and turn this grading rubric in, filled out just like this. In fact, we need to make that red to show that we need to cite some sources. So this tells us the areas that we need to improve in our presentation before turning it in. This is exactly how I want the rubric done to grade your rough draft. And now I don't want you to be disheartened, okay? Um, I've looked at a lot of the rough drafts, and most of them are getting grades similar to this right now, because we're still missing some sources. We're still missing some visual aids. We're still missing some of the explanation of how things work. We're still missing the explanations of why, scientifically, why are these recommendations going to help somebody? We're missing some information. So this is an opportunity for you to go back, grade your own presentation as if you're a really mean teacher, and find out where you can improve it. Because if you do hit all these bullet points in every section, then you get 100%. And if you don't, you might end up with something like this. Okay. So that's it. It was a pretty long video. I hope that you paused and came back if you needed to refocus. Keep up the good work.